Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us at this relatively early hour, earlier than I know you would have desired. Very happy to have with us today the head of our Office of Regional Economic Integration, Iwan Aziz, and Professor Jeffrey Sachs of Columbia University, Director of the Earth Institute. At 10 o'clock today, we'll be having our governor's seminar on how Asia can respond to the economic crisis. In conjunction with that seminar today, ADB is also launching a small 100-page monograph of the same title, and it's available on our website now. So I know you're all eager to speak to both of our panelists today. So without further ado, I'll invite Dr. Aziz and then Professor Sachs to offer some opening remarks, and then we'll open up the floor to your questions. Dr. Aziz.
Thank you, Jason. Good morning. My name is Iwan Aziz. I'm the head of the Office of Regional Economic Integration, ADB. This governor seminar this year's topic is really what Jason mentioned. How can Asia respond to global economic crisis and transformation? So let me give the background why that title. You know, before the collapse of Lehman in October 2008, so way before the Eurozone crisis, Asian policymakers has been struggling to deal with numerous development challenges because Asia in general has been doing quite well in terms of growth and macroeconomic performance. But some black spots, I call it, also emerge. For example, increased inequality is widespread across Asia. Declining employment elasticity. Now, let me just explain quickly what is the concept of employment elasticity. The capacity of the economy to generate employment has been also declining. And this is all happening while the macroeconomic performance, while the growth has been quite good. Not to mention the environmental repercussions of this high growth performance. In some resource-rich countries in Asia, we observe the depletion of natural resources. Of course, almost everywhere in Asia, the pollutions of all types, air pollution, water pollution, and so on, has been also not doing very well. So, all in all, create major challenges for policymakers in Asia. So, they have been doing this for a couple of years, actually. But then came the global financial crisis, started in October 2008 with the US crisis. Now, of course, this have sort of serious impact on the rest of the world because US is the world's largest economy. As far as the impact on Asia is concerned, there are two channels. One is the trade channel and the second is the financial channel. On the trade channel, it is no secret that many Asian countries are export-oriented economies. And if we are looking at the trade pattern in Asia, as far as the final goods trade is concerned, Asia has been trading mostly with US and Europe. The intra-Asian trade has been heavy in intermediate goods, but not in final goods. As far as final goods is concerned, it's with the US and Europe. Now, with the recession in the US, with the declining growth in the US, that translates into lower demand, and that hits some of the export-oriented Asian economies. That is the trade channel. The financial channel is also happening through, especially during the Eurozone crisis, through the deleveraging of many of the financial sector in Europe. And Asia financial sector, despite the fact that they are far more resilient compared to prior to 1997 Asian financial crisis, they got some impact. Cost of borrowing definitely is increasing. And also, one of the most important sort of credits, and this is something to do with the trade financing, has been also impacted. And we all know that trade financing, even though it is financing, so it is falling under the category of financial channel, but it may affect also the trade activities. So all in all, the Asian policymakers are now facing another more short-term challenges, and that is something to do with the US crisis and Eurozone crisis. So here you are, while you are struggling, still struggling to deal with the long-term and medium development challenges which I described earlier, all of a sudden there's another short-term immediate shock coming from US and Europe. So that is really the issues that this governor seminar is trying to discuss. So the main purpose of the governor seminars today is really to stir debate, to invite discussion surrounding these issues that I'm just explaining to you. Now, the second, and of course there are many implications of it, and I don't want to elaborate now because you will hear from the speakers as well as from the governors who will attend in the governor seminars later. But let me just mention two implications of it. One is that this may need a reassessment on the growth and development models in Asia. The second implication is that this also may need sort of reassessment in terms of the kind or the type of the regional cooperation in Asia, and how cooperations between Asia and the rest of the world is going to shape up. So those are examples of implications of these challenges that I was telling you earlier. The second point, and the last point that I'm going to mention here before I give the floor to Jeff, is the increase in inequality, as I indicated earlier. In the past, increase in inequality is seen as the impact or the sort of byproduct of growth and development strategy. So when you are growing fast, when you are trying to focus on making GDP growth high and so forth, it is almost inevitable that your inequality is also increasing. So that was the old thinking. But now the new thinking is that increased inequality can also jeopardize the prospect of growth, especially the medium-term prospect of growth. There are several channels to explain this. Let me just mention a couple of them. One is that, of course, higher inequality implies greater social and political instability. And that translates into uncertainty, that translates into lower investment, and that translates into lower growth. So that is one example of a channel. The second is that with high inequality, there is rent-seeking activities, and that rent-seeking activities itself is also sort of putting more pressure on robust activities, robust investment, robust consumption, and so forth, and that leads to lower growth as well. Another channel is higher transaction costs, because usually when you have a higher inequality, you also implies a higher transaction cost. And that also creates some sort of a dampening effect on the growth, the prospect of growth. And last but not least is really the uncertainty in terms of the property rights when you have high inequality. And so all these are new channels that now policymakers are trying to sort of analyze that. So basically the main issues that we are going to discuss is really along the line that I'm just describing to you. How policymakers have to deal with the short-term challenge, i.e. the crisis in Europe and the US, and at the same time also deal with the long-term and medium-term development challenges. So what we need to avoid is really the financial crisis to become development crisis. So I'll stop there, and now let me invite Jeff.
Thank you very much, Yuan. I think the main challenge that we see is that the crisis in Europe and the United States persists. Clearly, we are not simply seeing a business cycle or a financial crisis in the North Atlantic, but something more structural. The world economy is changing. The medium-term growth prospects for Europe and the United States have slowed, and global growth depends more than ever on Asia. And this, of course, is the backdrop to this meeting and to the challenges that Asia faces. On the one side, there continues to be the risk that financial crisis, especially in Europe, and slow growth in general in the high-income world will jeopardize Asia's growth, which, if it happened, would then have a significant global multiplier effect because Asia's growth is holding up so much of the growth of other parts of the world as well, especially Latin America and Africa. So the first question is how to ensure a kind of breakwater between any adverse effects of Europe's financial crisis on Asia. The second challenge, as Dr. Aziz just said, is how to maintain rapid and sustainable economic development in Asia in a global economic environment in which the North Atlantic, which has traditionally been the market for Asian exports, will be slow growing and no doubt will also become more protectionist on the margin, more resistant to rapid export increases from Asia. So Asia has its own challenge of maintaining its rapid economic development, which the world needs and which Asia needs, in a context in which both Europe and the United States will continue to experience slow and, I would say, fitful growth. Let me just take on these issues briefly. First, why will growth in the U.S. and Europe remain low and difficult? First, we know that Europe has slipped back into a recession, so there is a double-digit recession underway in the European Union and notably the Eurozone. There is little prospect of any rapid economic recovery in that region. The problem is that the underlying financial conditions in Europe remain fraught with problems. The banking sector is undercapitalized. There is continuing credit contraction and deleveraging taking place in Europe, and this is heavily impacting the economies in the short term. Given the large budget deficits that many of the European countries face, budgets are being cut, and that is amplifying the financial crisis. So we're still in the deleveraging and budget cutting phase in Europe. This is unlikely to change in the next couple of years. Europe needs to do a better job of getting past its financial crisis. It has not adequately addressed the banking crisis, in my view, and this is the reason why Europe's growth remains so difficult and why the Eurozone remains in a crisis-fighting mode. In the United States, the situation is a little bit better, but the U.S. economy is also structurally imbalanced. The U.S. was growing on the basis of large borrowing and a housing boom up to 2008, and since the end of that bubble, there has not been a robust basis for growth. And there is no chance and no desire to institute a bubble economy. And so the U.S. has to find other ways to grow, mainly investment and export-led growth. And I would say that that has not happened to any significant extent to this point. So the U.S. and Europe, in my view, are experiencing the aftermath of a financial crisis, but also the signs of mature economies with lower rates of return relative to the emerging economies, and with the need for structural reforms of various sorts to instill investment-led growth, but those have not happened. From Asia's perspective, that means slow-growing markets, I would say protectionist tendencies in the traditional markets, and the continuing risks of financial contagion or at least financial squeeze, especially from global institutions based in the U.S. and Europe, which are still deleveraging to an extent. This means, as we know, that Asia will need to find outlets for growth that are different from rapid export growth in the U.S. and Europe. I think there's ample opportunity for that. It doesn't mean only consumption-led growth, though there's scope clearly in China for more consumer-led growth given the rapid rise of incomes and given the super high saving rates. It also means investment-led growth, especially building infrastructure, fighting pollution, making cities more resilient to climate change, taking steps, in other words, to ensure long-term quality of life in Asia through public and private investments in core infrastructure such as housing, roads, power, information technologies, climate resilience, pollution control, and so forth. We know that there are trillions of dollars of investments that need to be made throughout Asia. They will provide an engine of growth and high returns for Asia, and Asia saves enough to support that investment without having to rely on external financing. The question is the quality of the investment process, the quality of the financial systems to intermediate that, the role of public institutions like the Asian Development Bank, as well as private institutions like the banking sector, the bond markets, and other kinds of market-based finance. This is Asia's biggest challenge, it seems to me. There's also an opportunity for Asia to find new export markets other than the traditional ones. And Africa, for example, is an export market because Africa is a continent of 1 billion people, now starting to grow at good rates, 6% per year, capable absolutely of growing at 8% per year or higher, and in desperate need of major infrastructure, everything one can imagine: roads, rail, power, information technology, water and sanitation and sewerage systems. Everything that Asia has to offer and in which Asia is highly competitive because Asia is going through this process of massive infrastructure building. And so with proper financing, Africa too can be a major export market and a source of growth that I think is extremely promising and important for the world. The point then, and I'll close here to open it up for questions, is that Asia has a short-term challenge of ensuring that the continuing slow growth in the North Atlantic does not translate into either a crisis or much slower dynamism in Asia. And it has a challenge of medium and long-term development model to put Asia on a path of sustainable development. And I'll emphasize sustainable, not only in its financial and economic sense, but environmental sense. Asia has demonstrated the capacity to set all world records of economic growth, but it is yet to demonstrate the ability to set all records in terms of environmentally sustainable rapid economic growth. And in my view, that is the next challenge, and that is a great way to deploy saving in this region, to put Asia on a robust status with respect to energy, food supplies, natural hazards, climate change resiliency, pollution control, as absolutely fundamental challenges and a great place to channel Asia's vast saving. Let me stop here and turn it back to you, Jason.
Gentlemen, thank you very much. The floor is now open for your questions. We just ask that you identify yourself and your news organization, please. Somebody will bring the microphone to you. Thanks, Karen.
Good morning. I'm Melo Acuna from China Radio International. Gentlemen, let me just ask you, how stable is the US dollar? And is there a need for Asia to come up with its own currency? Thank you.
Dr. Aziz, you want to take that one first? And then Professor Sachs?
Well, definitely, as an economy is growing and becoming large, like China, for example, definitely the role of that economy's currency become very important. It's just a matter of the time. It's not a matter of yes or no, but it is a matter of the time. Now, that is really the challenge, and also that is really the things that no one really can predict in terms of the speed of how currency, renminbi, the Chinese currency, can become more international currencies. Now, as far as the stability of the US dollar, I think it has something to do also with other currencies, because when you talk about exchange rate, basically you're talking about the price of two things, US dollar vis-a-vis what. So I will ask Jeff to explain what's happening with the euro and so forth, because when you talk about US dollar stability, you're talking about US dollar vis-a-vis other currencies.
I think the most basic point is that the dollar has been nearly the sole reserve currency of the international system for decades. And going forward, it cannot really play that role. Ideally, we would like to see at least 3 or 4 reserve currencies and a flexible arrangement among them. That would be the dollar, the euro, the yuan, and possibly other Asian currencies, the yen, and so forth. The world would be helped by having, at this point, multiple stable reserve currencies. The euro, of course, is a shock right now, how fragile the euro zone is, especially the institutional failures that have been exposed by Europe's crisis. And it's important not only for Europe, but for the world that Europe fix these structural problems. The structural problems involve the role of the European Central Bank and the need to clean up the European banking system. Those are two major issues. And of course, fiscal policy in Europe is also an issue, but I think I would put emphasis on the European financial system as being key to get the euro as once again, as a new pillar of a multi-currency system. In Asia, the problem, of course, is that there is no single currency right now, and the yuan has not been an international currency, though China correctly is working hard now to make the renminbi internationalized, and that will help the international system as another pillar in this system. So I don't see any way that the dollar can be a stable sole reserve currency any longer. The United States is not in a position to play that role. The role of the U.S. economy in the world is diminishing in relative terms. The problems of fiscal policy in the U.S. and the competitiveness challenges of the U.S. Make it impossible for the U.S. to be the single robust currency. This has been a process that's been going on for years, but it's become absolutely clear in recent years. And therefore, adding in stronger regional monetary cooperation in Asia and a stronger role for the renminbi are absolutely important for the functioning of the international system. This is the direction that is taking place right now. It's definitely China's policy desire, and it's an appropriate one. And I hope the timing works out so that this proceeds apace, because the world really needs several pillars right now in which the dollar will be more flexible and nobody's sole reserve.
Other questions? Toyota-san.
Hello. I'm Yukiko Tora from Kyodo News. Mr. Aziz, you mentioned now Aziz is being faced with so many challenges, and Okay, can you hear me? Now it's okay? Yeah, Dr. Aziz, you mentioned that Asia is now being faced with so many challenges and that we have to reassess how to make the regional cooperation. So in the context, how do you evaluate ASEAN Plus 3's effort to boost up the chamber initiative? I think they will agree to double the amount of the whole of the, the process.
Let me mention just two examples. Of course, there are many, but let me just mention two. If we recall, after the Asian financial crisis, policymakers and officials in the region realized that one of the key factors behind the Asian financial crisis is the double mismatch. Double mismatch means the mismatch in the currency because you borrow in foreign currency, but you lend in domestic currency. That's the first mismatch. And the second mismatch is the maturity mismatch because you borrow short term, but you spend in long term. So that is one of the key factors explaining the Asian financial crisis. So officials in the region started to think about what is the way and the strategy to avoid that from happening again. And they came up with this idea of developing the Asian bonds market, the Asian Bond Market Initiative, ABMI, initiated in 2002 and 2003. So the whole idea is that Asia, which is having excess saving, should try to make the excess saving stay in the region, stay in Asia, rather than invest it in the US or in Europe, and then reinvest it back in Asia, which is like a round tripping. So instead of doing that, create an investment environment within Asia in such that the excess savings stay in Asia. And one of, not the only one, but one of the reasons why that did not happen, because there is not enough long-term investment instrument in the region. So this is the story behind the bonds market creation, because bonds market is one of the long-term investment instrument. And officials in the region started to develop that, and it is already a decade now, since 2002, a decade. And this is the reasons why tomorrow I encourage you to attend. There is a special discussion, special seminar on ABMI, trying to evaluate what is the progress, what are the challenges of the ABMI since the inception 10 years ago. So that is one. The second is that the Asian official also realized that the need for having an alternative resource or short-term financing if one of the members fall into crisis again. And this is really the birth of the CMI. Originally it was called the CMI, Chiang Mai Initiative, but then later on it was multilateralized. So now the name is CMIM, Chiang Mai Initiative Multilateralized. The whole idea is that the region's trying to provide an alternative financial safety net. As I said, in case one member of the region fall into crisis, there is an alternative financial safety net on top of their own, that is domestic financial safety net, and the global financial safety net, which is traditionally coming from the IMF. So that was really the rationale of having this CMIM. Now, if you look at the progress of the CMIM, you heard that recently the officials of ASEAN Plus 3 did change the IMF link, because in the past, up to a few months ago, the link is really 70-30, meaning that 30% can be used, the fund, whatever the amount of fund in the CMIM, but the 70% has to abide to the IMF conditionality. But recently they changed into from 80-20 to 70-30. So now they reduced the IMF link from 80 to 70. The second thing that the official did recently is to increase the amount of that fund within the CMIM, doubling actually from 120 billion to 240 billion. So those are examples of efforts done by the official in the region trying to sort of provide an alternative financial safety net. And this is very, very important, especially in the light of what Jeff mentions, what's going on in Europe, what's going on in the US. It will take several years. And Asia, despite the fact that so far has been resilient, Asia will not be free from the contagion impact of the global financial crisis. And that is the importance of the regional financial safety net like the one that I just mentioned.
Nothing much to add except that we've learned that currency swaps between central banks are hugely important as short-term, flexible, dynamic ways to fight liquidity crises in the banking sector. And so I am in favor of everything which expands the Qingmai flexibility, the relative delinkage with the IMF, in other words, the increased readiness of Asian countries by themselves to move quickly in the event of a crisis is well noted and warranted. And so I think both the expansion of the size of the facility and the increased flexibility are important at this juncture.
We had originally said we'd end the press conference at 9, but I think we can extend it another 10 minutes if there are any more questions out there. Any questions from anyone? Yes.
Cecil Morales from the French news agency. Could you give us an idea of the level of investments right now of Asia into Africa that you mentioned? I know that China is doing a lot of these things now to supply oil to itself and minerals.
I don't have a comprehensive number of Asia's investments in Africa per year, but I think it's definitely no more than the low tens of billions of dollars, if that. But Africa's needs have been estimated as $70 to $100 billion a year for infrastructure investment that is unmet right now by international capital flows. So there's I think at least an additional $50 billion a year that could profitably flow to Africa for core investments in the power sector, rail, roads, and the IT backbone that is not flowing right now. The China Development Bank is a very major player, and this is all to the good, in my opinion. It's helping Africa tremendously, and I believe these are robust and high-return investments. I think a lot more can and should be done, and that this would also help to rebalance the world economy, because if Asia helps to finance large-scale investments in Africa, not only will African development speed clearly, but this will be a major base for Asia's exports, and Asia is the low-cost provider of mass infrastructure right now in the world, and because of its own experience and its own capacity to carry out very large, complicated, and effective infrastructure projects. And so I would think that with some organization, planning, and a political framework, another $50 billion a year could flow to sub-Saharan Africa in a very, very effective way for annual infrastructure investment, with Asia providing a lot of both the savings and the exports that would go along with that. Not, of course, the only region to do that, but I think that Asia would play a unique role in that.
Time for a couple more questions. Please.
Hi, I'm Warren de Guzman, ANC. Essentially, I think you're saying that you want Asia to do a little bit more spending. But, you know, you also mentioned that Asia also has excess savings, but this is also a big factor in why we feel protected against the European debt crisis. So how do you suggest that we start spending when the European debt crisis is still there?
Yeah, it's almost like watching a movie with two sequels. Sequel 1 is prior to 1997 Asian financial crisis. The feature of that movie is Asian economy was characterized by excess investment. So we invest more than what we save. How could that happen? Well, as I said earlier, we borrow a lot from abroad, short-term unhedged, and that brought down Asia into crisis in '97. But then the second sequel of the movie is almost the opposite. Now Asia has excess saving. Now, the problem is that most of this excess saving was invested outside Asia with relatively low return and so forth. But by the private sectors in the US and Europe, these money were reinvested in Asia. So it's a round tripping, right? And the cost is high and so forth. The irony is that while Asia has a lot of excess saving, Asia also needs a lot of spending for infrastructure. And we are not just talking about physical infrastructure, but we are also talking about non-physical like education, health, and so forth. So the whole idea is that why not use the excess saving in Asia, stay in Asia? There are many ways to do that. Of course, there's no one single way, but there are many ways, and I indicated earlier, creating long-term bonds market, local currency bonds market is one way to do it, so that it will provide good return, safe return for the investors. At the same time, also the money can be used to build those physical and non-physical infrastructure. So that is one way to see how the excess saving has to be utilized within the region, so that we are not really, having just excess saving and then this excess saving invested outside. Another important point about this excess saving is that most of this excess savings so far are not yet put in the productive infrastructure or productive sectors. So basically two things. One is that how to make the excess savings stay in the region, and number two, how this excess saving can be spent in productive sector.
ADB estimates that Asia's FDI to Africa was 29 billion in 2010. So low tens of billions, and I would say it could be 50 to 100 billion quite comfortably, so that is in line. On this question, I think just to concur and to add to this point, first of all, Asia saves, so this is not a matter of borrowing from the rest of the world. This can be done prudently with Asian saving. Second, the mechanisms of financing are important. To avoid the risk of a major credit crisis, long-term projects like infrastructure should be financed by long-term financing mechanisms rather than through bank loans backed by short-term deposits, as happened pre-1997. So there are ways to protect the financial sector as it intermediates saving and long-term structural investment. Third, Asia needs a very hefty stock of foreign exchange reserves, and it has that. And it needs ample mechanisms for central bank credit swaps within Asia, and Chiang Mai and other initiatives are supporting that. So the point is that Asia can shift to more investment and consumption within Asia prudently, without destabilizing its financial sector and without taking away the cushion that it has rightly built up. This should not be financed by short-term capital flows, still less short-term capital flows from abroad, but rather intermediation that is well done within Asia itself.
Maybe time for one last question for Dennis. Somebody bring him. Thanks for
Dennis Haworth with Interpress. In this discussion, we were talking about Asia generally, but I wonder whether or not that needs to be a little bit of disaggregated, since you have very different situations and roles and challenges in, for example, Japan, China, ASEAN, and South Asia. And perhaps you can discuss a little bit about what kinds of different functions and roles and problems that these four regions, say, face. Of course, we're forgetting about where I live, Taiwan, but that's the standard fare. The other issue is the investments in Africa is, I think, very interesting. But for example, the PRC investing in Africa, there's many what we politely could term as governance issues. For example, looking at what has been going on in Sudan, Zambia, and other areas, and how sustainable is that kind of, this notion of building up in infrastructure investments if such governance issues are not dealt with?
That is a very good point, because we tend to talk about Asia as if this is just homogeneous regions. Actually, as the questioner pointed out, it is different. You know, you have Japan, you have China, you have ASEAN, you have South Asia, and so forth. Now, this reflects upon the different kind of policy challenges. Like, for example, when we are talking about the need to shift from export dependent towards domestic demand. Now, what is the domestic demand? It can be investment oriented, it can be consumption oriented. There is the difference, the example in terms of the different strategy, different policy challenges. For example, in the case of China, maybe the domestic demand is more towards consumption. But in the case of ASEAN countries, the domestic demand is more towards investment, because indeed the investment level in ASEAN countries has not been back to the level prior to the Asian financial crisis. So that is just one example. Of course, there are many other examples. But having said that, there is another trend which is very, very important happening in the region, especially after the Lehman collapse, after 2008, and that is increased integration. So even though you have South Asia, you have China, you have ASEAN, but the degree of integration has been increasing. And this is happening in both trade as well as in financial sector. Of course, the financial sector, degree of financial sector integration is less than trade integration, but it is catching up, especially after the Lehman collapse. For example, the cross-border holding of the bonds, for example, within the region, is still low, but it is increasing. The latest figures we had is about 10%. But if you look at just before the Lehman collapse, it was less than 5% as far as the intra-Asian cross-border holding of the bonds market. So yes, there are very differences in terms of the condition as well as in terms of the policy challenge, but at the same time, there is a trend of integration, more integrated system. Last point is that South Asia, because one of the big story of the success story of the Asian economy the last couple of years is really the production network, right? But recently, the South Asian countries, in particular India, is also interested to participate in this fast-growing and successful production network in East Asia. And indeed, if we look at the trade pattern, the share of the Asia trade with the US and Europe, the G2, has been declining, whereas the share of the export of Asia and other Asian countries and other emerging markets has been increasing. So we are moving toward the direction where the production network will not be concentrating only in the East Asia part, but also throughout the rest of Asia.
Again, just to add to that, and very briefly, without question, we're seeing taking shape the Asian growth pole for the world economy, in which Asia's growth is not mainly an impulse from the North Atlantic, but is an impulse from within the region. And so this is happening, and it's likely to succeed and to be robust. And it has many different elements to it, but it will mean a lot of integration and a lot of structural change within Asia. A lot of the infrastructure that needs to be developed will be multi-country or regional scale infrastructure in transport, in power, in communications, and so forth. Production systems are changing, especially as wages start to rise in China. There will be a lot of restructuring of where low-cost production takes place within the Asian economies. Some of what's currently produced in China will be produced in ASEAN countries as a result of this. China will have its own changing structure of employment. And then we talked about the financial integration as being essential. So there is, of course, a lot of differentiation within Asia and different roles, different division of labor, different needs. But there's also this common feature of an increasingly integrated structure and policy challenge within Asia, which we're really putting emphasis on this morning. In terms of governance issues in Africa, without going into all of the dynamics, I believe that governance improves within an economic framework and strategy. So to the extent that there is large-scale investment by Asia in Africa and large-scale financing of Africa's infrastructure in roads, power, and other areas, this is an opportunity to improve the business environment in Africa considerably. I'm referring mainly in this case to economic governance, which I think is really important. And we know from the experience of Asia itself that as Asian economies became more outward-oriented, part of regional and global production networks, and that this improved the economic governance structures of the region. I rather like the idea that Asia-Africa intensified relations would change and improve the ability of Africa to attract foreign investment more generally, enable Africa to play an increased role in global production systems and the international division of labor. I don't much subscribe to the view that Europe and the U.S. focus on governance in Africa and Asia does not, and that's a problem with Asian role in Africa. I think that's a big oversimplification, actually. I think that what China is engaging in Africa is very much to mutual benefit of China and Africa in terms of long-term development, and think that one gets improved governance in the context of larger scale economic interaction. So I'm a big fan of going in, doing more, investing more, and building a sound institutional framework for getting the good returns of those investments, and think that that can be managed.
Professor Sachs, Dr. Aziz, thank you so much for joining us this morning. Be sure to join these gentlemen and our distinguished panel of finance officials at this morning's Governor Seminar at 10 o'clock. And you can download the new study, How Asia Can Respond to the Global Economic Crisis and Transformation, at adb.org. Thank you. Press releases are being handed out by Hilda. If you haven't received one, come grab her. It'll also be online.